Welcome to the Blu-ray presentation of J. Lee Thompson's 10 to Midnight. This is David Delval of filmsandreview.com, and I'm honored to be here today with the legendary producer Pancho Coner and John Crowther, who was the casting director on this film and also a screenplay writer who's done a number of Charles Bronson projects, including The Evil That Men Do. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking time to talk about this amazing, transgressive, violent, kind of strange, kind of not a horror film, not a slasher film, but like a prototype unto itself. Let me start with you, Mr. Coner. What are your memories of this particular film as far as a producer?
This was a sort of a surprise film, and we had very little money to make it with. We made a deal with Menahem Golan to make the film, start the film the day before we were to leave for Cannes and the film festival to pre-sell territories. We disagreed on reimbursing me for the story we had chosen, and on principle he said, I can't reimburse you. And I said, well, then we can't make this film. And he said, well, do you have any other title? And I'd always liked the title 10 to Midnight. And he said he loved it. We'll go there and we'll sell 10 to Midnight. And so we went, and I sat in the suite at the Carlton, and buyers came through, and I told a fictional story, and it was advertised, 10 to Midnight, Charles Bronson. And when I came back to Los Angeles, I called my friends, does anyone have a Bronson story? And Lance Houle, with whom I'd already worked with, knew of a writer, and there's a screenplay called Bloody Sunday. And it was good. And Charlie liked it. So we renamed it 10 to Midnight, and we started filming, I think, within 6 or 7 weeks.
Well, Charles Bronson is an interesting movie star because he kind of carved a special place for himself in film history with Death Wish, the Michael Winner film that went on to make so much money and kind of placed Charles Bronson in the same category as Clint Eastwood, and not just an action star, but literally an actor that could maintain a presence that you just literally wrote. He invested every line with a special kind of authority. I've noticed in watching this particular film that ordinary dialogue in anyone else's hands, when he says it, it takes on a whole new meaning. And he had this ability, and from what I was told from the very beginning, he always knew or wanted to be a leading man, which was probably very, it was like an obstacle that he had such an amazing looking face, and he was so stoic looking.
Charlie had been in 40 or 50 films and lesser roles, and several television series. And it was only when he went to Europe and made French films like Someone Behind the Door or Rider on the Rain that he became an international star, and then came back here. He did The Red Sun in Spain, came back here, and all of a sudden he was a star here.
A huge star, and I think Cannon was so thrilled to have him. I know of the action stars that they had, Chuck Norris being also one of their big money makers, Jean-Claude Van Damme, to a lesser extent Michael Dudikoff, all younger action stars, but Bronson was really the jewel in the crown for Golan Globus, as far as I remember it.
Well, I think also it was really a period, it was the beginning of the period where those kind of offbeat action stars could take hold.
Well, yes. I mean, we had gone from, the pretty boy actor of the 30s and the more kind of conventional leading man to Dustin Hoffman. And, Bronson came in at the end of that, where we were getting more anti-heroes. And Cannon, I enjoyed I was a reader at Cannon, and I worked under Chris Pierce. And we were told at the time, every script that came in, they were put in 3 piles, one for Jean-Claude Van Damme, one for Chuck Norris, and one for Charles Bronson. And at one point, they even had him marked to play the Golem. which I thought was fantastic with that great face of his. And he wouldn't have had any dialogue, I don't think. They may have given him some. But I thought, he would enjoy that. But of course, alas, it never got made. But this movie has achieved cult status, and that's a much overworked term. But I think in this case, it's mainly due not only to the iconic status of Charles Bronson, but this actor we're watching on screen right now, Gene Davis, the brother of Brad Davis, who became a star after Midnight Express and wound up working in Fassbinder's Curel and became a very high-profile actor. He went on to Broadway and did such things as Entertaining Mr. Sloan, where he replaces Maxwell Caulfield at the West End, and just achieved all kinds. Gene to a lesser extent. But, John, can you talk a little bit about how Gene Davis got in this film?
Yeah, it's interesting because the part as written looked incredibly easy to cast because it called for somebody who was anywhere between the age of 18 and 30 and could be anything. He just had to be a villain, but he could look against type. He could be fat. He could be thin. So and I thought, boy, we're in Hollywood. There's going to be a million actors. And so we started reading people, and we never quite, everybody was good. Gene was in the final 4, I think, 4 or 5, and that we actually tested. And none of them really quite totally nailed it. I mean, I think Gene turned out to be terrific and was a great choice, but nobody was quite there. And so we settled on Gene, and I think made the right choice. But it was not easy for the opposite reason that I thought. I thought it was going to be difficult because we'd have so many that we just said, wow, that's it. And it was the opposite.
Well, now, was nudity an issue? Because did you tell the actors coming in that they would be basically nude through most of the film?
Yes, and it was not an issue.
No, of course not with actors.
Right. Yeah. An interesting little side note is that Darren Sarafian, who's Richard Sarafian's son, the director,
yes,
and wound up, he's a director himself now, he came in and read for us, and he wound up playing a small part where he's only nude, the two people in the car. Do you remember that? And with no lines.
Now, did you have film on Gene that you watched before? Had he done some features prior to this?
I don't think we had film on him.
Because I know he's in William Friedkin's Cruising.
Yeah.
And once again, it's interesting that both of Gene Davis's best-known movies are very sexually ambiguous, very edgy, very sexy performances.
Well, what's interesting is that at that time, it was much more difficult for actors to have demo reels. Once video took hold to the extent that it has today and everything that's come since then, now an actor must have a reel. Back then, it was, if you had a reel, it had to be on 35 millimeter.
Now, how much input did Charles Bronson have as far as casting approval? And, of course, he was working. I think it's interesting at this point, Mr. Kohner, to bring up your relationship with Charles Bronson and J. Lee Thompson and how the three of you became this kind of unit at Cannon where it became very comfortable for Bronson to work in an environment where he trusts everyone. He trusted you, he trusted J. Lee Thompson, and he felt like Cannon was kind of home to him for these pictures because he made so many of them. And they all made money, and he was treated, as I recall, like a star. And he insisted on that, I believe.
This was his first picture for Cannon, but Charlie, J. Lee, and I had made 2 films before. We made St. Ives for Warner Brothers and The White Buffalo for Dino De Laurentiis, United Artists. And this was the 3rd film together. The 3 of us made 8 films together. And we were very comfortable. By then, we were using the same key crew members. We were all very compatible. We respected Charlie's contract, which said an 8-hour workday, and that meant 8 hours from when he arrived on the set to when he'd say goodbye. Prior to our working together, producers had worked him 10, 12, 16 hours and taken advantage of him. So when we started working and that was the deal, we said, great. Lee Thompson had been an editor. He knew exactly what he needed, shot very little footage. And we knew that we would be finishing work in 8 hours, except for maybe some pickup shots or extra shots. Crew loved it. They had a normal work day.
Everybody was happy.
Everybody was happy. We finished the pictures always on schedule and on budget. And it was a nice working relationship.
Well, Bronson, from what I'm told, knew what he wanted, knew he was very confident in his abilities. Therefore, when he was given dialogue, maybe he would read it and think it's okay, and then when it would actually come time to say the lines, he would say, I'm told from some people that were working on this film that he would say, you know what, I'm going to change the line. I don't like this.
He'd do worse than that. He wouldn't come out of his trailer.
Oh, I get it.
So the second assistant would come to J. Lee and myself and say, there must be some problem. Mr. Bronson is not coming out of his trailer. So we'd go over, but before we'd quickly look at the day's work, and Lee was such a pro at this, he'd say, oh, my God, the wrong person. This should be spoken, this line, by the star. And obviously Charlie has seen that. So we go into the trailer and immediately say, Charlie, oh, forgive us. There's a little mistake in the script here. You should be speaking this line, don't you think?
That's wonderful.
Charlie, would you mind if you spoke this line? And Charlie would say, I think that's a good idea, Lee. Yes, we'll just switch it around. And then he'd come out. But he knew what the star should be saying. And he didn't ever play the second banana. He didn't want to ever disappoint his audience. He knew his audience, and he knew what they expected of him.
So when he's playing these kind of roles after Death Wish, maybe it wasn't always his personal taste, but being a movie star and knowing your public is essential in continuing and being able to give what they want. That's very common at MGM back in the 30s and 40s. You know, stars were so concerned with image, and that really didn't stop, did it? They always have their own.
You know, along that line, I have a story when we were doing The Evil That Men Do, and I had the unique situation of being, as the writer on that film, on location from beginning to end, and we were shooting a scene, and Charlie disagreed with it completely. He thought it should go another way totally, and J. Lee and I wanted one way, Charlie wanted another way, and we were at an impasse, and finally it was agreed that I would rewrite the scene the way Charlie wanted it, but he would shoot both of them, both versions, and he agreed to that. And one of the things that I will never forget about Charlie, and it's a great story about who he was, he played both of them fully. He gave both versions.
He was a professional.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, his relationship with Andrew Stevens in this, as it's written in the script, Andrew Stevens is a rather bland, by-the-book, honest cop. But in the way Bronson and he relate to each other in this, it's, even though one is younger and perhaps still has a moral code that Bronson's characters, whether it's Death Wish or this, we're basically talking about a man that's going to be a vigilante at some point. And you see that they still work together very well. And I was rather taken with the fact that Bronson was able to invest characters like this with so much dimension. And even though he has a reputation for being kind of one note sometimes in the manner of John Wayne and on another level, but we both know these actors are capable of giving kind of nuanced performances. With this film, though, this is a good point to bring this up, the violence in this is extreme for the time. And the violence toward women is equally extreme. And one of the things that hurt this film when it first came out was a review that Roger Ebert gave it, which was one of the most scathing I think Roger ever gave, just an action movie, because he went off on the misogyny of it. and said, why must we continually see? But we have changed so much. Here we are in 2015 where there's a whole subgenre called torture porn. There's movies like Hostel. There are films in Italy. Dario Argento made a career out of finding different ways to dispatch beautiful women. So this is not a new idea, but in the time this movie was made, it was kind of the scapegoat for it in a way, because Roger Ebert's review was so pointed at this film. And of course, he even brought up the fact that J. Lee Thompson had directed what many consider his masterpiece, which is Cape Fear, which in a way is basically the same thing. You know, it's a violent movie, and women are the objects of a lot of mayhem. But when you're making, how did Charlie feel about this kind of movie? Did he ever talk about having to be in such violent films?
I don't think so. I think after Death Wish and playing the role of vigilante, that was part of his persona. He made at least 5, if not 6, Death Wishes afterwards. And this film is a vigilante film. This film ends in a vigilante action. But going back for a moment to Andrew Stevens, that was a good piece of casting, because Andrew was not only a very good actor, but strong enough to stand up to Charles Bronson, to force Charles Bronson to reconsider his actions in the story. Also, I believe he approved of Andrew starting a relationship with his daughter, with Bronson's character's daughter. There was some respect and affection between the two.
Well, you can see it in the film.
And the other, of course, he had worked with Charlie before, but the other thing about it was that we saw a lot of actors for this role, a lot of name actors. I remember one of the people we saw was Frank Sinatra Jr.
Oh my God, that would have been odd.
Yeah, but when it came right down to the choice, Andrew was a slam dunk.
Oh, I can. Well, I don't know if he had done De Palma's The Fury yet.
I don't remember.
But he's really remarkable in that. And he's working with such people as John Cassavetes and Kirk Douglas and that. And then, of course, he became a producer in his own right later on, son of Stella Stevens.
Right. But I think of that generation, one of the most underrated actors in terms of reputation, because he's a wonderful actor.
Well, Bronson has had some interesting co-stars, younger men. I know when he did The Mechanic, he had Jan Michael Vincent when Jan Michael Vincent was still, still workable. And the relationship they had was very interesting. And you can see it again in this film with Andrew Stevens. So
he loved working with good actors. I mean, that was one of the interesting things about it. He knew that a good actor working with him brought everything up. I remember on Evil That Men Do, we had Jose Ferrer. And he loved working with Jose.
Well, and Jose had been a proper director, aside from being a great Academy Award-winning actor.
Academy Award, Broadway star, a great actor, and Charlie loved working with him.
Now, this film had a couple of moments where had you always decided on that ending, the ending as because it's a really shocking ending. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, we actually had an alternate. We'll go ahead and spoil the ending.
Well, I think since it's a movie that people
with
probably
30 police cars screeching to a stop, and Gene is taunting Charlie, saying, "You'll never be able to kill me because I'll claim insanity. I'm sick, and I'll be back." And Charlie says, "No, you won't," and fires one shot into his forehead, with everyone standing around watching it. Now, how does Kessler, the detective, get out of this?
Well, we never know.
Well, I know that's the end of the film. Hopefully, maybe the 30 police cars and the policemen are all going to say, "We didn't see anything."
It's certainly more timely now. As I was coming to this commentary, I was reading the paper where once again policemen are shooting people for not even as much reason as Charles Bronson has in this movie, and a lot of them are walking away to the point that they have to have cameras all the time to keep everybody honest. It was a different world when this was made, but a lot of things that one thinks of as fantasy or just what the tropes of a thriller are now commonplace.
Well, we shot it both ways. We shot Charlie bringing that gun down and not firing, but it made him very weak, Charlie's character. And so we used this ending, the violent ending.
Did you have test screenings of this anywhere, or was it premiered anywhere prior to being released?
We did have a couple test screenings, yes.
Now, did J. Lee Thompson, did he feel like this movie was indicative of the kind of movies he would be making at Cannon? You know, that they would all be rather violent, or did he ever ask to look at so the scripts that were coming? I know some of the stuff I read wasn't always police thriller type movies, that there were some love stories and such. Did J. Lee and Bronson ever think about doing something a little different out of those pictures at Cannon? Or?
No. Menahem used to say, every reel, every 10 minutes, you got to have an explosion or the machine guns killing every 10 minutes. That's because these films made most of their money abroad. I think at least 60, and this is back 30 years ago, 60% of the income came from foreign distribution, which in foreign distribution, they wanted a more violent, more graphic film story.
Well, I remember that, Menahem would take up whole floors of the Carlton Hotel. I mean, his spending for the Cannes Film Festival was legendary.
Yeah.
And a lot of the product that they would offer, some of it would never get made. Some of it was already in the process of being made. But they were showmen. And what I remember about Menahem most, which I think is kind of the way I like to remember him, was that he loved movies. Menahem was a real film
absolutely
buff.
He loved to participate in them. He would get in the editing room with us and with J. Lee and argue his point of view. He'd respect, of course, the director's point of view, but he loved to get in there. He directed films himself, films that were very artistic attempts.
Well, I remember when Runaway Train was being made at Cannon, they put a lot of time into promoting that because it was a prestige film, and I think it got nominated for an Oscar. And Menahem was very proud of that. And he also got Godard. He got Zeffirelli. People don't realize how rough it was for someone like Menahem to come to Hollywood, an Israeli, and almost create another studio in a town that was very hostile toward him. He knew this, and I think it caused him a great deal of unhappiness to have to I felt like at times he felt like he bought his way into town, because no matter how many movies he made, no matter how many jobs he gave, there was always a kind of snobbery about him for a while. But towards when he really started achieving success, and they've made almost 300 movies. This is an unparalleled from 1979 to 1991. Cannon Films was a presence in Hollywood, and you have to realize that. And I think this documentary I worked on called Electric Boogaloo really is a Valentine to Golan Globus, not just because of the temerity they had in a lot of the things they did, but the sheer joy in which they made movies. Because that really wasn't the norm in Hollywood at the time that they came in. The joy in making movies was not quite the same. But he was someone you could go in his office at any time and he would listen to you, and you could talk about movies with him. I did, and I was nobody, and I was very impressed with him, as a businessman and as a film lover, not just as a producer.
It reminds me that when you're talking about the script and what Pancho said, and you were saying about the fights on every 10 pages. I had to pitch to him an idea for a prequel script. Missing in Action was in production, and they wanted to do a prequel to it. and before it was even finished production. And so I was asked to do a story and come pitch it to Menahem. And so I started to pitch it. I said, okay, Braddock gets out of Vietnam, comes back to the States, and finds out his wife has left him. And then he winds up going into a bar, and he gets into a fight with a bunch of guys who recognize him and think he's, say, okay, you're so tough. And Menahem stopped me. That was as far as I got into the story. Menahem stopped me. He said, what page is that on? And I said, oh, probably about page 10. He said, make it page 2. Okay, you got a deal.
Now, did Menahem sit in the editing room of this at all?
Yes.
And what were his?
We would show him a cut in the screening room, and then he'd come into the editing room and said, "Let's try this, try that," and it was always very loud. And as an Israeli, when there was an argument, the personal space, he'd come right up into your face, and if you didn't understand his cultural background, you'd think, "Whoa, what's he doing?" But they was used to, and as an Israeli, he would argue 10 inches away from your face, and you just hold your ground
yes.
and argue back, and then it all worked out just fine.
So, to have made 8 films for him, you must have really understood his process down to the...
And we developed others. That Golan film that you mentioned was, we spent probably $200,000 in preparation, trying to figure out how to make this golem appear through brick walls, coming up out of a shower drain as clay figure. We didn't have the CGI digital effects then, and we had to do this all with rubber and we did all sorts of tests. We never got around to making it, but it was a favorite story of his. It took place in New York City, where a golem has been brought years before and has now become a vigilante. At least the man who controls it is trying to clean up that area of New York by sending the golem out at night. Charlie plays the detective who is tracking this down, trying to figure out what's making mayhem in this neighborhood that he grew up in.
So he would not have played the title character.
Not the golem. The golem was just a clay 9-foot figure.
Because I could certainly see him doing that.
But there's a face-off at the end in a baseball stadium, the golem against Charlie Bronson.
Now there's the title.
Right. Well, unfortunately, that story got tied up in litigation with the end of Canon Films, but it's
well, I remember when they had poster art for it on the roof, which is where they used to put these large placards, these like little mini billboards. But back to this movie, the 10 to Midnight story, I do see parallels in this with Ted Bundy, and of course that horrific story years ago of Richard Speck, who walked into a apartment building that had, I think, 8 nurses sharing an apartment, murdered every one of them but one, who hid under the bed. Can you imagine? And had to listen to all of her friends being slaughtered by this man. And then, of course, both of them, Richard Speck was in jail for years, enjoying all kinds of privileges that should not have been given to him, I think. But so there is a kind of real-life counterpart to all of this.
Oh, it's completely credible.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's really one of the interesting things about it, is that for all the mayhem that nowadays goes so over the top, the over-the-topness of this was credible.
What do you think of the cult status that this film is achieving? Because if you look on the internet and you type in 10 to Midnight, you get all of these websites of very young guys, particularly guys, that have seen this movie countless times, and they really think it's just amazing because this character is so, perverse.
It's a little scary.
It's a little scary, and of course, what makes it more scary is that it's plausible. When we talk about people like Ted Bundy, who was very charismatic and good-looking.
Yeah, only nowadays he would probably be an ISIS sympathizer.
Well, exactly. I mean, and terror. This is a terrorism of a certain kind. But Bronson has a great line in this where it's one of his Freudian moments where he says, well, the killer's using a knife as his penis. And it's certainly the way the shots are set up when he's breaking into these houses and killing these women. It's there, you know. And Bronson has this very peculiar way of taking dialogue and making it in such a way that if you were reading one of these scripts, you just would never imagine how he could make it his own, which is what makes a star, I think. But Mr. Kohner, when he finished this picture, did you remember the first time he saw it in a screening room, or?
Well, it was a strange situation. We were rushing and working nights, and I made two mistakes. We screened it at the Fox screening room, their big Daryl Zanuck screening room, and I was sitting in the back between Charlie and Jill, his wife. And I had been seeing it over and over, and we had been working through the nights, and I fell asleep.
In the middle of this?
And Jill apparently let me snore at least once before she jabbed me.
Oh, no.
And I woke up with a snort, and Charlie laughed.
Well,
and I took them all to dinner that night to a sushi restaurant on Pico, not realizing that Charlie and Jill did not like sushi at all. Sushi was the hot new thing there. It was a nice big restaurant. We had a large group. And so he excused himself early. And I said, I hope it's because of the sushi, Charlie. And he laughed and said, yes, I love the film. So.
Well, that's, you know, this is a thing that I was hearing about him on sets, that, you know, he wouldn't eat with the cast and crew. He liked to have his meals in his trailer. And that when you're raised in poverty, as he had been, the whole idea of being able to go into really good 4-star restaurants and have your meals was very important to him. And
well,
I think that
John and I have had so many meals. He always ate with the key members on the set. Maybe on someone else's film he didn't, but we were.
But on these,
on all the Bronson films, we ate together.
Now, we were down in Mexico and shooting in a little village, and so we were eating out at tables on the outside. It was hard to get to, and so on. This was on Evil the Men Do, and he kind of adopted this little village orphan. I mean, this was really a remote village, and this was a little kid who had he was a homeless little kid who just everybody fed him, and he would sleep, and Charlie adopted him and had him sitting there at the table with everybody else, making sure that he got fed before anybody else, because the crew and everything, the caterers wanted to feed him. But Charlie was practically every day that we were there, he had that little kid there making sure that he was being taken care of right with everybody.
Now, Michael Winner, on the other hand, would not eat with the crew and insisted on having ceramic plates and silverware.
Yes. Well, I think Michael Winner was a decidedly different personality from J. Lee Thompson. Talk a little bit about J. Lee Thompson and his personality, and because, you know, he had, as a little bit of background, he had been a very successful British film director. He'd made some really amazing films, not to mention 2 Planet of the Apes movies, and of course the Cape Fear
and the Guns of Navarone.
So, I mean, this man knew his craft. So, and he was around 73 years old when he made this film. So, can you tell me a little bit about what his process was like?
First of all, he was a gentleman. Oh, yeah. He knew his craft thoroughly.
Absolutely.
He enjoyed being with the crew and with all of us. J. Lee, in his earlier days, had been a bit of a drinker.
Yes. And
he had a couple of run-ins with the Beverly Hills police. And finally, he left La Scala one night, drove across the street, and drove straight into the Bank of America. And the judge said, you're either going to jail or never going to drive again. So when I first met him, he didn't drive, and so I drove him. And it gave us the opportunity. We shared an office. We shared a trailer on the set. And So we had that very special relationship
Yeah.
of having spent a lot of time together.
I wanted to bring up, there was a scene we were just, as you were talking, I noticed that one of the most popular scenes in this movie for the fans is the scene where Bronson picks up this sexual aid that's found in Gene Davis's apartment. And I just think, this is part and parcel with him, having to finally plant evidence on this guy. But I just can't get over what a performance Gene Davis is giving, because there's no real background into why he's doing this, except he doesn't seem to be able to relate to women at all. And when he does, it's always the wrong thing. And he's very awkward, even though he has this outward appearance of being such a handsome, pulled together looking man. But when you start talking to him, you realize he's complete. And this is all due to the way Gene Davis is playing this. And I think that's something that J. Lee Thompson really had a knack for, is working and understanding how to get this kind of performance. And I'm told that Gene Davis was very volatile in this, that at some point, he would get so carried away that at one point I'm told he broke a girl's arm in a scene where it was,
no, he
dislocated.
She was bruised. The following day, she couldn't come to work, and we had to take her to a doctor. Gene had just manhandled her too hard. And
well, he was obviously, and there's Robert Lyons. And Wilford Brimley. Talk a little bit about this amazing supporting cast.
Oh, God, Wilford.
And I think Bronson enjoyed having these kind of actors, like Pancho was talking about.
Well, J. Lee was terrific with actors. I mean, he really understood. One of the things that I remember when we were casting this movie, and I would hear it from him every day, we were just bringing actors through one after another to read for him, and he would say, television actor, television actor. Television actor.
Right.
And then those would come in and he'd say, yeah, this is a movie actor. So he really, there was a difference there that he understood. And so he knew when he had an actor who could give a real film performance as opposed to a...
Well, when a director like J. Lee is working so many times with someone of the caliber of Bronson, did he have any particular set of rules that he kept as far as how he would bring in Bronson to make sure that he gave the kind of performance that his fans would expect, and yet still be true to what the project was in terms of the script? And although when you get Bronson, but still you get a little, I mean, when you were talking about the White Buffalo and St. Ives and some of these, he really does give some unusual performances in his career.
Again, Charlie liked company for the meals, and we did so many night shoots on his movies. We'd have dinner midnight or something, and it was always J. Lee and Charlie, John if he was on the film, myself, and maybe an actor or two. And there was a lot of discussion about the scene, the upcoming scene at that time. And then J. Lee just let them loose. There was very little direction once the scene was playing, but there was always discussion beforehand. Even when J. Lee was blocking out the shot, he would do so with the actors, not with stand-ins. So,
well, you can tell when an editor is a director because, as you mentioned earlier, he doesn't waste film and he shoots exactly what he knows he can use.
Well, and one of the things that's interesting with Charlie and Little Note, is it's not uncommon for stars when you have a day player doing their close-up for the star for the off-screen lines to be done by the assistant director. But Charlie not only was always there off screen for the day players, he gave a performance. He gave them something to work off. And that was part of the dynamic also with him. It's Charlie's professionalism, but also the dynamic with J. Lee.
Yes.
I mean, there was a joy about acting and about the process that you got from both of them.
Well, one of the things I admire about Bronson is this silence that he manages to, he just owns the space he's in. And even though his dialogue sometimes is sparse, when he's given dialogue, he paces how he's going to put it together, and he knows what a look is. He has that same quality that someone like Alan Ladd had. You know, Alan Ladd knew what a look was. These are the actors of that period, and Bronson was kind of a not, I want to say, not old-fashioned, but he was one of the last of the action movie stars of his generation, like Robert Mitchum or John Wayne.
Well, he was professional.
Yes.
I mean, and again, to process. He understood the whole process, and enjoyed being part of that. You know, he was a professional.
Another plus in this film, J. Lee liked to keep his camera moving. In this case, we had, I think it was Adam Greenberg was the cinematographer. Adam is a large man, and he was his own camera operator, which is difficult to do on a studio film because unions want an operator and a separate lighting cameraman. But Adam Greenberg carried the camera, and we didn't have Steadicam. He had it on his shoulder, and the camera work is excellent.
No, it's a film that has. I mean, when I first saw it, once you get over the shock of a killer that's walking around nude, and you also have the kind of violence that for this period was kind of startling. Once you get over that and begin looking at the film as a film, you realize, you know, J. Lee Thompson's what his strong points were, and you also realized, you know, more again how Bronson controlled these kind of performances. And I think it's important that a star know what works, because sometimes you can get, especially in Hollywood, you surround yourself with people that always say yes. And pretty soon you're completely at sea as far as what's working and what isn't, because no one will dare say to you, don't do that. I don't think that's quite what you need to do.
The thing that I remember from the films that I worked on was this kind of amazing gestalt. Again, I'm talking about Charlie and Jay Lee, but also with Pancho. So every time I was involved in a film with them, there was this kind of unity that was happening with the three of them that just made things easier and fun and kept things moving. It was just three people who really knew how to work together very, very well.
Oh, well, you guys are legendary at Canon. I mean, I was hearing about Mr. Kohner and Jay Lee and Bronson because, you know, each collaboration was not only successful, but it brought upon another one. But I don't think, Mr. Kohner, was it possible that they each film, when it ended, you weren't really trying to make a series of them? You just if Charlie wanted to work, something would be found for him. And he could.
Yes, well, Charlie would often make another film in between because he would have like an 8-week shoot. Then we've got to do post-production another 8-10 weeks and pre-production another film. So he'd go off and make another film. And sometimes Jay Lee would go off and make another film. And so we would have another director. Charlie and I would have Stuart Rosenberg for Love and Bullets, Charlie. We had Peter Hunt for Assassination because Jay Lee was busy on another film.
Yes.
But it was just a really nice working relationship.
Well, could you talk a little bit about the more personal side of Charles Bronson, and especially with this amazing relationship he had with Jill Ireland? Because they seem to be in Hollywood like one of the perfect couples. What were they like? And she appeared in a number of his films, not this one particularly, but she has appeared with him in several films.
Well, way back, the two couples not married to each other. Jill was married to David McCallum. The two couples were friends. The two couples separately broke up, and Jill and Charlie got together. David McCallum was always a friend still of Charlie and Jill's. I first met Jill when I was working on John Huston's Freud in Munich in, I hate to say, 1961. I met Charlie when I was living and working in Europe. He was doing The Red Sun in Spain. And
with Toshiro Mifune.
Yes, and René Clément's film, Rider on the Rain, I think it was. Or anyway, I knew Charlie a long time, and I knew Jill. They had 7 children between them, his, theirs, and hers. I mean, it's a big family. When we made a film called The Evil That Men Do in Mexico, we had a lady, a British lady, who had a 12-year-old daughter, and Jill was a co-producer on that film, and she worked with Hillary. And when the film was over,
they were casting.
Casting, yes.
Yeah.
When the film was over, we came back to Los Angeles. Our casting lady there, John was the writer on that. He was with us in Mexico. But Hillary had a heart attack, and here's this 12-year-old girl who called me in the middle of the night. I ran down there, and I didn't know what to do. I was a bachelor. I called Charlie and Jill, told them what had happened. This is 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning. They came down immediately, scooped her up, and took her back to their house.
With her dog.
With her dog. And they then, from age 12 on, she was part of their family. I was the legal guardian, but they accepted having her one of their family, and they raised her.
That's a wonderful story.
It's an amazing story. It's extraordinary. And what was important is that all the things you heard about Charlie and Jill are true.
Yes.
I mean, this was an amazing relationship, and particularly a Hollywood relationship. And the other thing, adding on to that, Pancho had a memorial, a kind of a get-together at his house for Hillary, and Charlie and Jill were there. And while they were there, and the girl was there, while they were there, they got a call from the house saying the dog had gotten out of the house and gotten hit by a car on Sunset Boulevard, and so had been taken to a vet. And because the people who hit the car took it to a vet and then called the house. And everybody said, well, how did they know the dog to call the Bronson's house? And it was because the day that they took that girl in, she went and got a tag with their number on it, so that the girl would know that she was really welcome in their family.
Oh,
that day.
Yes. Well, see, this is why you have to. People have personas, and I think in Hollywood, you kind of it becomes kind of a.
That's Kelly Preston on the
Kelly
left.
Preston, yes.
Yeah.
Now, do you remember the casting for these for the female?
Iva Lane in the center with the dark hair.
Right.
Lisa Eilbacher.
Yeah, we were continuing to cast right on into during the shoot because there was such a big cast. So a lot of the smaller parts, we were bringing actors to the set to read them in breaks on the set.
Well, they all went on to do other things,
yeah.
so
yeah.
These choices were actually
yeah.
understandable, and they all played out. But once again with the nurses, it's just like it's almost like it's a deliberate reminder of the Richard Speck killings and how the evil that men do, if you will. It's all very inherent in this. When Gene Davis was working on this at Nite, how were the blocking off traffic and such for that run when he's running? Do you remember all of that?
That was at the Veterans Administration. We have a location manager, unit production manager, Bob Ortwin, who had somehow a relationship with the Veterans Administration. At those times, we couldn't pay them cash to shoot there. We would give them gifts of television sets, Christmas trees at Christmas. We shot multiple films at the VA in Westwood. And Bob, I'm not sure how, we had a trunk full of boxes of See's candies that he would use to bribe anyone he had to deal with there. And so that was all at night. I must say it was winter, too. The crew was very nice. to the fact that our actor was having to be naked in front of
Well, he must
the
have
crew,
been free. Gene
and
Davis
it was
must
cold.
have been free, and of course, no shoes.
Yes, I mean it's the crew is very kind, very supportive to see this guy doing
all
this.
this.
It's not easy to do that.
Do you remember what happened when this film came out? I'm trying to figure out, when someone gives a performance like this, it either works for you sometimes that you have made such an impression, but if it's a negative impression, and I don't mean from the standpoint of his acting ability, but playing such a disliked character that he could be shot in the head at the end of it and everyone's really rooting for that because you really want him to be punished. But yet he should have gotten a lot more work after this because this is a real tour de force.
Oh, he turned into a producer rather quickly. He enjoyed that.
I guess he felt that acting wasn't all that. Well, and of course what Brad was going through too. Hollywood is not an easy place. We know this.
Right.
We know this.
I meant Andrew turned into a producer.
Yeah, not Gene.
Gene, he kept working, but not as much as one hoped.
Yeah, Andrew was very smart. I mean, because he was one of the first people to go into direct-to-video movies.
Oh, yes.
They were genre pictures, but he did very, very well at it. He was smart.
Well, it was like that other actor, Mark Damon, that became the head of PSO.
Same thing.
Same thing. Yeah. Sometimes you get in the business and then you find out what it is you do best. I used to go to the American film market all the time, and of course Canon had an enormous presence there. And I do remember when these movies were being marketed. 10 to Midnight was, basically we have another Death Wish movie by any other name, which is what you have here. But unlike the Death Wish movies, this film has now created a life of its own. And this is something that's very much a part of the culture we're in now with the internet. A movie takes on a life of its own because I know Roger Corman has said many times, if we had known that people were going to be putting these movies on DVD and it would be on Netflix and people are watching them over and over again and taking moments out. People will play the scene where Bronson finds the AccuJack and they'll play it back and forth. And if J. Lee Thompson or Roger Corman had known, they would have probably said, geez, we better do this because it's going to be watched a million times. But it's a business. And you're making films, you're under contract, you're doing things by the book, and you don't stop to think about critical appraisal 30 years later, 40 years later. I think it's amazing that we're here in 2015 watching this movie. I know Mr. Kohner must be a bit taken back, but this is your first commentary, so I'm so pleased you're doing it with me because this movie I've always remembered it, and I'm sure a lot of fans are of the same mind, that there's just something about it. It's just an attitude. It's just a kind of the way it was so ballsy at the time, and it just was not quite like the movies that were being made outside of Canon, because Canon made movies to entertain, make no mistake, and sometimes they just followed trends. I found that with AIP it was the same thing. AIP thought they had the youth market at hand, but isn't it odd that most of their youth pictures, when they would come out, they were like they already seemed a bit dated. Whereas these movies that Bronson did kind of seem to withstand the test of time.
Well, going back to what you were saying before, each movie, and this is something, with Pancho, all the movies he's made are like that. Each movie is a standalone movie. It's not part of a genre. It's not part of a brand. It's this movie stands on its own, and each of the Bronson movies are like that, as you were saying before, Pancho. And I think that that has a lot to do with what you're talking about.
Yes.
The AIP was very much like, okay, this is the kind of movie we make, and even though these were vigilante movies, violent movies, and so on, they were still. Each one was on its own.
Well, let's talk a little bit about distribution since we're talking about AIP, because those AIP movies of the 60s and early 70s, there was a drive-in market. And I think by the time we get to 10 to Midnight, that market wasn't quite as widespread as it was. These movies were literally going into theaters, and they were going into theaters around the world. And then, of course, deals were made. Do you remember that process? You know, the deals being made so these movies would be in theaters for so long, and then would go on to VHS. And
I think VHS was just
starting.
starting, and it was very important, the sales.
Well, what I remember about VHS at the time of this was like $79 in a video store. I mean, VHS, they were expensive.
Yeah.
A brand new movie from a major company could be as much as $100. It was only a few years later in the late 80s when they started bringing the prices down. And of course, now we're getting into a market where everything is downloadable. And there we have Netflix and Redbox and all this other, and you can watch movies on your phone. I mean, it's a different world.
Part of that nowadays is the manufacturing process, because a DVD, you just stamp them out one right after another. It was much more difficult to make a VHS, to record them. You had to have banks of.
But actually, the VHS is going to last longer than the DVD. You just touch a DVD with your finger, and it's no good anymore.
Well, it's all going to be it's all up in the air with Cleopatra's bed. I think everything's in the ether. But one of the things I remember that's a fan favorite with this is Gene Davis's dirty phone calls, his obscene phone calls, where he plays, he puts on a Mexican voice, or he does all this kind of crazy stuff, and it's just such a zany kind of off-kilter movie. Just when you think it's like if you're watching multiple episodes of cop shows, and they're so prevalent, still are. You would think their eyes would roll back in their head in another movie where a detective describes procedure, but they seem to never get an end of it. And David McCallum got a second career playing, the fellow that the coroner. Week after week, talking about all these different ways people have been dispatched.
There was a moment when we needed Jane to say a dirty line on the phone in Spanish. And everyone knew that I was Mexican, but I don't look typically Mexican, Pancho. But my co-producer, Lance Hool, who looked even less. He's Norwegian Mexican, but he had grown up and gone through high school in Mexico. So I quickly called Lance. I said, Lance, we need something dirty for Jane to say on the phone, because I didn't have that sort of experience. And so Lance searched his memory and came up with a dirty line.
Well,
by the way, that was McCallum, wasn't it?
That was Paul McCallum.
Paul McCallum,
yes.
Here.
That's
Charlie's,
Paul McCallum. That's one of Jill's children. By David.
And one of the stepchildren of Charlie.
Well, he looks a little like Dean Paul Martin, Dino, from. But yes, I was also going to ask, since we're at this point, I think it's kind of interesting, Mr. Kohner, to talk about your background as part of a very legendary family, because Paul Kohner was one of the great agents, and Walter Kohner. These two men handled the biggest names in Hollywood from practically the beginning of the business. I believe Paul represented Erich von Stroheim. Walter represented Max von Sydow. I mean, the client list of your family's agency is absolutely the who's who of Hollywood. And there was never agents more respected. And it's just such a when I first came to Hollywood, the first time I met Walter Kohner, I was taken to Scandia by Charles Hyam, and Walter was the other guest. And I just sat in awe of his stories about the business. When did you realize how did you feel growing up in a show business family like that? And of course, your mother is the amazing.
My mother, who just turned 105, made the first Spanish-speaking film in 1931 and starred in 34 films. And my sister had an Academy Award nomination for Imitation of Life. Her two sons, Paul and Chris Weitz, have done everything from American Pie to About a Boy, The Golden Compass, on and on and on. So that the family, but way back there, I was ready to work at the farthest tip of South America. I just wanted to get away from this, but by chance I was in school in France, and my sister was starting playing Mrs. Freud to Montgomery Clift in John Huston's film, and I'd grown up with German, and I went to Munich, got a job, and I was bitten by the bug, and that was it. Once you start...
How did your father feel when you embraced the business at last?
I think he was pleased. There's a Hollywood story. Two young friends bump into each other on the studio lot, and one congratulates the other, say, "Hey, I understand you're going to be a producer. That's fantastic. How did it happen?" And the first fellow says, "Well, I was walking across the lot just like this yesterday, and I bumped into my father, and he took a liking to me." Well, it wasn't that easy. I worked in Europe on every job in a film for 12 years, and then made my own film in Mexico. But I must say, making a film is one of the great adventures that you can have in any capacity.
How many films have you made? Have you produced at this point?
About 20.
What's your favorite
of the Bronson films? The White Buffalo
with Jack Warden?
With Jack Warden, I love that film.
It's a really interesting movie because it's not your typical. It's not a Western. It's an adventure film. And I remember the first time I saw that, I was really impressed with it. I like The White Buffalo. But your sister, Susan Kohner, has made some very good... I remember Imitation of Life. That was the Lana Turner version,
yes,
wasn't it? Yeah. I think people, speaking of Douglas Sirk, he has gotten kind of a second... He's now a very much a respected auteur, and his, people like Fassbender revere him. Movies like All That Heaven Allows, and what do you think of the reassessment of movies now, where we're sitting in booths like this trying to reassess what was just made as an entertainment, and now of course is having a life as its own.
It's the accessibility.
Yes,
you can now see movies on your iPhone. At my mother's 105th birthday this weekend, the Mexican newspaper El Excelsior had a full-page thing, was on the internet, and then they have clips of her, and you tap one place, and you can see the full-length 1931 Santa, which has been one of the major films of Mexico in international cinema. But you can see it right there. And
it's right available to you.
Yes, and John recently told me that my first two directorial efforts are on YouTube, and they're on my iPhone. I can look at my first film, The Bridge in the Jungle, with John Huston playing his father's role. And
it's amazing for young actors, which I remember when I was starting out as an actor. You probably remember this too. We didn't have these kind of resources. Now I know that young actors and the ones I work with will say, "Oh, I'm going to look at all the James Dean movies," or "I'm going to," and they'll go on a binge of watching this actor or that actor. You couldn't do that then.
Well, I noticed too, though, oddly enough, with the internet so handy, right at your fingertips. A lot of the millennials don't really know who Tyrone Power was. They don't know they don't know who Robert Taylor was. They really have the attention span has shortened, and with that, but there are still young film buffs that really will go back and look at these movies. There's Jeffrey Lewis.
Jeffrey Lewis was a terrific actor.
Terrific actor, and we just lost him not that long ago.
Yeah.
His daughter is a good actress.
I remember him from Salem's Lot, that TV series that was based on Stephen King's novel.
But the thing with actors in terms of what's available to them and what they know is so much is available to them that you can understand if there are going to be great areas where they don't know. It's just it's going to happen. There's just so much time and so much attention.
Just in looking at a scene like this, the way it's lit, the way it's cut, the way the actors are, you've got everyone in this is a pro. This is the kind of filmmaking that I'm sure J. Lee Thompson is remembered for now. A professional filmmaker, editor, and he'd been in films, as we said before, those great British movies he did, The Guns of Navarone, all of that. And I think
Tiger
it's
Bay.
Tiger Bay. That's a great film. But, just the way everybody in this, is kind of, you've got, it's almost like an ensemble piece where everybody knows what they're doing. And
well, he had an incredible command of narrative. Aside from what you see on the screen, he really understood how a script was put together. I had been working on The Evil That Men Do for several months. And by the time we started to shoot, and Jay Lee was a last-minute replacement. He wasn't able to direct it because I think he was cutting this film.
No, he was working on, I'm not sure.
He was cutting a
was
film.
Was he in Mykonos doing the Greek Tycoon, or he did The Passenger?
Oh, yeah.
The Passage. Yes, he was not available because he was in The Passage.
He wasn't available, and then
the day before beginning of filming this, the director we had chosen was just always going to make a different film than what I was going to do, and these were what everyone called a producer's film. So I called the financier, and I spoke to Charlie. I said, we've got to replace him. Day after you start shooting, you can't replace the director because he then is in charge, and the actors have an allegiance to him. So I had to call the director in the night before and let him go. And he said, "Who's replacing me?" And I said, "I haven't called anyone but you're definitely off." And I called Jay Lee. I knew he had just returned to L.A. And I said, "There's going to be a ticket messenger to your door, and I'm asking you to come and join us and direct this film. And lucky you, it's already cast, location's already chosen. All you have to do is come down and direct it." And he knew I needed him. And he came down the next day. We started the next day, finished the film on schedule, on budget, and we had a marvelous time.
Yeah, and what he did was he because he had almost no time to familiarize himself with the script, and so he said to me, I was down there in Mexico, he said, "You're going to stay here right through the shoot." And I said, "Fine, okay." And we got together every single day to discuss how everything shot the next day fit in to the narrative arc, so he could make whatever changes, whatever additions. I could make whatever changes he wants. But it was an amazing thing to be working on location with the director, rewriting with that director day by day, but to understand not just his understanding of narrative and the process, but also Charlie's. Charlie would do a thing where he would say to me, "Why does this happen?" And I would say, "Well, it's because this, and then that other, and that's the background to that." And Charlie would look at me and say, "Oh yeah, you're going to put that in a pamphlet and hand it out to the audience?"
How important was the music in these films you did for Canon? Like, say, this for 10 to Midnight. How did you choose?
Bob Ragland, he was terrific. He worked with us at one point. Charlie's son, Val McCallum, did the music in one of these films, but Bob Ragland did the majority of them. And what a pro. He was good.
Did he do, besides 10 to Midnight, did he do
several others?
Several others?
Yes.
Now, I noticed that Bronson's very proud of his wardrobe in this because he seems to have some rather natty suits in this as a detective. He's always got color-coordinated shirts and ties. Was he very hands-on with...
Charlie had, luckily, a very large basement in his house, and it saved us storage. We delivered all his suits back to his house. And then when we were starting the next film, the wardrobe person would go with him and go through his stuff, anything new we'd have made, but often he'd have multiples of a suit or a jacket that would be used on the film. So he had his collection of wardrobe.
And so for the Canon films, he literally in his basement had
we
the
did,
wardrobe.
Remember 12, yeah.
You had 12,
8 films for Canon.
8 films
12
for Canon.
films I did with him. And Charlie, having lunch or dinner with Charlie, it was And downtown restaurants went up. It was just strict. Grilled meat, grilled fish, some salad with lemon on it. Nothing. He was always on a diet. He never changed. He worked out. Physically, he always looked the same. He once said to me, "You know what I'm looking forward to in retirement, Pancho?" I said, "I'm going to be able to eat anything. I'm always hungry."
Well, how was his retirement, such as it was? What do you remember of the last days of Charles Bronson?
Oh, Charles got Alzheimer's at the end, so it was difficult. J. Lee and I would have lunch with him often, and he had more and more difficulty.
When was
Jill
this,
died.
George?
Oh, I'd have to look up the dates, but he married a lovely lady, Kim, who was just terrific with him. And
he seemed to be very lucky with the women in his life, didn't he? As far
yes, he had a great charm. He was a family man.
Yeah.
Loved the children.
I've heard this story before, that sometimes when he appeared to be grumpy or out of sorts, if a child was around, he could just revert to being this kind of very smiling and very,
Yes,
happy.
absolutely.
And so it's kind of, people get reputations, and you want to believe in the stereotypical things that like that circulated around canon when I was there, because it was like if Charles Bronson called, you put him right through to whatever he was. In other words, there was a certain kind of immediacy because he was the star. And I remember one girl was like she was new, and she really didn't know who the actors were, who stars were. And Bronson called, and she was like, "Well, would you mind? And what is this about?" And he said, "Do you know who I am?" And she was telling the story down where we were having coffee, and I said, "Well, he's a star. And if you don't know that, you shouldn't be taking the calls from Menaham's desk," because, that was kind of a wild place to be at that time, because I remember going in one day and these Israeli soldiers were there with Uzis. Do you remember that? When it was like there was a death threat there at some point during a crisis, and they were on the top floor, and it was all it was never boring. It was never boring at Cannon, I can tell you
In the
that.
middle of the film, I got a call at 2 a.m. from the switchboard at Cannon. And the lady said, "I have a lady who says she's Charles Bronson's aunt, and someone has died in the family in Philadelphia, and they'd like us to put them through to Charles at 2 a.m. And I asked them to repeat that, and then I called Charles and woke him up. I said, "Charlie, there's a call apparently from your family in Philadelphia." And he said, "Who are they asking for?" They said, "For Charles Bronson." And he said, "Hang up on them. That's not my family. They know my name is Buczynski."
Oh, that's yes, of course. But when Charles first started, I remember I did a lot of work with Vincent Price. And one of the first things Charlie did as Charlie Buczynski was House of Wax. Mm-hmm. And he was a mute called Igor. And he had this great physique with that amazing face. And then Vincent did another movie with him called Master of the World. And here's what Price had to say. He said, of all the actors I've worked with, he's the only one I couldn't make friends with. This was around the 60s. So the Charles Bronson that you knew from this period, I think there was a period of time when he was just building his brand.
But Charlie was not easy to get to know.
This is what I've
heard. He was very
distant.
He was very, and when we were working on this movie, I mean, it was funny because I would come on the set, and anytime I was talking with Charlie, I must have had a look because he started calling me the koala bear.
Well,
and he was always this presence that was now I didn't really get to know him well until The Evil That Men Do, and then I really, just loved the man. But there was that distance he had. But talking about the family and Buczynski, the other interesting thing is that the assistant director, and Terry was on this, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah, Terry, his nephew, Terry Buczynski, was on this. He was on Evil That Men Do. He did a number of the Bronson films. And it was interesting because Terry is a delightful delightful, such a nice person, and one of the best assistant directors you're ever going to know. And I always found that fascinating, that somebody with his connection with Charlie, somebody who was, that kind of nepotism, could have skated. And what was interesting is he didn't skate, and Charlie would never have let him.
No,
and they had a great relationship. But you really got a sense of who they both were from that.
Well, did he really enjoy being this kind of action star? Was he happy with this, would you say, as far as you knew him?
I think he really enjoyed, on our films anyway, going to work and being around these bunch of friends. It's not brain surgery. This is having fun.
Yeah. So he did have fun on these movies.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because the Death Wish movies, especially the ones that were done at Cannon, I think it was probably number 4 is the one I remember, the one that was shot in Hollywood.
Yes.
That's outrageous. It's an outrageous movie. And the different ways in which a man who, let's face it, he is at an age where most men are not going around shooting people, and there he is at 70 plus, kicking ass and having just such a fabulous time. And I don't think anyone could have second guessed that this would have been his career.
Well, as Pancho said, it was pretty easy for him. By the last pictures he was making, he worked 8 hours a day.
Well, by then he could pretty much call the shots, couldn't he?
But there were other films that weren't in this vein. If you go back to Noon, what was it? The Noon.
Oh, from noon till
noon to 5.
Noon till
3
5.
Or something.
That's the one with Jill Ireland, where they have this relationship. I think she's a prostitute and he's a John.
Well, no. That's where it's a Western. And he's supposed to go in and take the town with all the other bad guys, but his horse throws a shoe. So they say, yeah, you're going to have to stay here. There's a ranch over there. He goes there, and there's this widow.
Oh, that's right. I'm thinking.
And she's very attractive. It's Jill. And they hear a stallion kicking a stall, and they say, go down there and see. Maybe there's a horse for you. And he goes down there, and there's a stallion there, but there's this widow up in the house. He comes back and says, no, it was just a donkey. And he spends the afternoon with Jill
From noon
while
till
the rest
3,
of the bad guys go in and get shot up. That's a marvelous film.
Yeah.
We did a film called Assassination for Cannon, where he is protecting the president's wife. Someone is trying
the First Lady.
The First Lady, and they do a chase cross-country. And that was a gentler, nicer film.
Well, it's interesting that of all the movies that he did, one of the first ones to get remade was The Mechanic, which Jason Statham remade a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But I imagine that they will do others as time goes by. I can't imagine remaking the Death Wish movies, but what do you want to bet they do at some point?
So let's keep going. Well, Jodie Foster did one, where a Death Wish or a vigilante film.
Yeah. It's interesting because you were talking before about Charlie and did he enjoy the work? And one of the things I remember on The Evil That Men Do is there did come a time when we had to go over time and a considerable overtime.
Work more than 8 hours.
Work more than 8 hours.
Yeah.
And he agreed to it readily. As I recall, it was readily.
Several times, whenever there was a problem.
So you wouldn't consider him to be difficult in the sense of
not at all.
If it was to get the film done, and for this movie, this went pretty smoothly considering some of the subject matter. Was his relationship with Gene Davis? Was he very helpful to him? Because this must have been a difficult part.
It was a friendly thing.
And he knew how difficult this must have been to play.
If we went on location, for instance, on Love and Bullets, again, John was our resident writer, and we were all over Switzerland. Charlie had his wife, his children, the nannies, the tutors. Everyone traveled with us. We're all in beautiful first-class hotels, and it was an adventure. It was great.
Well, this movie is I don't think we could say, I think the word guilty pleasure applies, but also I just think that we're in a period of time where we're just reassessing all of these films, especially with the movies that are coming out now, where you have so much real violence and
what this is great tight storytelling. I mean, it's when you again you get Jay Lee, you get Poncho, you get the writers, you get Charlie. I mean, it's just everybody is a totally solid professional
Yes.
and that's what that becomes about. It's not about egos. It's about getting the movie done and telling a great story and working together. And I think that's one of the strong points of this movie. That's why it works so well.
And because this movie made money for the financier, for Menahem Golan Globus, it enabled us to keep making more.
Yes, each one begat another.
Yes.
But I think, you can't really second guess how a movie's afterlife is going to be, because one of the reasons that I really wanted to talk about this movie is because, as I mentioned before, when the Roger Ebert review came out, and it was just like, oh, this is just this vile movie. And then all of a sudden, it's out there and people are renting it, people are downloading it, and all of a sudden you go online and you see that this is immensely popular with predominantly young male men that are like into this kind of movie. And all of a sudden it's like, it's Bronson, man. It's got all of this, and it's got a kind of popularity that you could never have second guessed when you're making it.
Well, I mean, that's a pretty good way to sell a movie. Is hey, here's a terrible movie that's about violence and killing women and beating people up and blood.
Well,
it's terrible. It's just awful.
It's just awful.
You're going to do well.
You can't wait to see it. Well, the other day I went to the Hollywood Forever to see Showgirls. Showgirls was a movie that was universally reviled when it came out, and it nearly destroyed the career of one of the women. Gina Gershon went on to do other things, but Elizabeth Berkley was like, her career was just tanking. And of course, she avoided talking about it. But guess what? Like 10 to Midnight, the movie goes out into the world to find its own way. And the next thing you know, 4,000 people are crowding into a cemetery to watch it at night. So you never know. And you just have to kind of assume. But one thing I'll have to say that I've learned from all of this, you don't set out to make a bad movie. You don't set out to make a cult film. It is kind of organic, to use that kind of overuse. It's an organic process. A movie has certain elements that may be transgressive and off-kilter, and then combined with the star wattage of someone like Bronson, it just takes on a life of its own.
Part of the canon process was to know exactly what you were doing. You knew the budget. You said, this is as much money we have to spend. And given the names of the people, so it's not a question of whether it's a good movie or bad. It's a question, we know this is going to gross at least this much.
Yes.
I mean, it's just a formula. And I don't mean a formula in the bad way. I mean a formula in the best sense of a formula. And that was canon. That was what they did.
But what's interesting?
We know what this is going to do.
It just occurred to me about canon. In those days, if a movie like this was successful, you'd make a sequel. I don't recall. I mean, you have the Death Wish series, but it wasn't like Cannon wanted to make Runaway Train 2 or 10 to Midnight Part 2. They just went, and that they don't do that now.
Right.
Every movie, if something works, like the Insidious series, we'll do part 1, part 3, part 4.
Well, it's brand. Everything
it's
now
a brand.
is brand.
It's a franchise.
Yeah, a franchise, right.
And of course, Canon was there first with the comic book things. They were going to do Spider-Man, and so they did Superman. They actually ended the Superman franchise, quite honestly. I remember when that was like Menahem just literally, that was when the Canon was hemorrhaging money. They were making these films. They would start movies like the Superman movie, $10 million. They'd say they would put it like this is going to be Menahem would say this is a $15 million film, and then $6 million into it, they had no more money. And yet they had to finish the film, and it wasn't the film he started, and it all started to unravel.
Yeah, but it became a whole different way of doing it from this movie, where they knew up front. They said, Bronson, this is, or Chuck Norris or whoever, they're going to gross this amount of money. As Pancho was saying before, so much of it was the foreign market, and you could count on that foreign market. You could punch it into the cash register.
Yes.
So they could say, okay, this is how much it's going to make foreign. This is how much it's going to make domestic, given these names. What's the budget, therefore, got to be?
Well, now, did you cast other films for Cannon besides this one, or did you
Missing
go back
in Action?
Missing in Action. How was
after this?
And then you went. You had some screenplays. There,
and then and that's a whole other. It's a long story. the whole story of Missing in Action and the prequel and so on.
Well, the Missing in Action movies made a lot of money.
Yeah, and see that was theoretically a franchise. What they did was they had Missing in Action, and then they decided to make the prequel to it. No, not the prequel. I'm sorry. It was not a prequel. It was the sequel. It was after he gets out of the prison, and comes back to the States. But they wound up liking the movie better than the original movie. So they released the second movie first and called it something like Missing in Action: The Beginning or something like that.
Well, now, tell me a little bit about the TV version of this as we watch a topless scene with, these nude actors. How did the TV version come about? And Pancho, did you have any?
Well, first of all, we shot Gene with and without black underpants, thinking that we'd have to have two versions.
Yes.
And they got mixed up, so you'll see sometimes, especially outside when he's running, sometimes he's wearing black underpants, sometimes he's naked. There's a little flaw.
So is the
there.
running time
See, there he's wearing black underpants.
And then some he's not. But the TV version of this, it just couldn't have been as outrageous as this is. Because one of the great things about doing this Blu-ray presentation is you're going to finally see this uncut as it was shown in theaters and in a beautiful presentation of it, which is the best way to see them. I mean, when I talk to people about Cannon films and the fans of this movie, when I told them I was going to work on this, some of my friends said, oh, wow, I saw this on Hollywood Boulevard. And there's a nostalgia to that. And there's kind of an anticipatory thing where, it makes a difference seeing it in a theater. Sometimes watching these movies at home, you get distracted, you get on the phone.
Yes.
And especially with comedies, it's not good to see them by yourself. It's better to see them in a theater. But this kind of film, all the suspense and the kind of feeling you get when you first see it in a theater, you really have to have that. And I think people that really felt nostalgia and kind of a little, the Cannon movies, it's like, oh, wow, I remember. And when Mark Hartley did that documentary, it was amazing to me. We got nearly 200 people like Sharon Stone, Richard Chamberlain, Jean-Claude Van Damme. Everybody would come in and talk about their experiences with Menahem and Yoram and the budgets, the crazy stories, the traveling, the locations, all of it. When was the last time you saw Menahem? Do you remember, Pancho?
It's probably 10 years. He moved back to Israel. I know he was in Cannes a couple of times, but I wasn't there. And then he died.
Yes. He died right after. Well, it was funny. We came in and asked him to be in the documentary, and he listened to what was going on and said, you know what, I'm going to do a documentary. And he did one, and it was released before the one that Mark was doing, because he was Australian, so he was doing this. He was flying all over the world to meet just everybody. And it was typical Menahem. That's a great idea. You know what? I've got it in production while you've been talking. Right. And I think it speaks volumes that his came out first. And I think that's the reason we didn't get Chuck Norris to appear on camera, because he was loyal. Or he waited. Or I forgot. I don't know the exact circumstances, but I wondered where he was because we saw so many of them. But
don't open the door.
Don't open the door. Don't go in the house. But they do, of course.
Oh, no. No.
But
Kelly Preston.
Yeah.
Iva Lane.
What do you remember about her from the casting? Did she just win you over the first time she read for you, or?
Well, I don't really remember that well because we were working so fast.
This is
I mean,
this is when Iva got beaten up.
That's
too
right.
much.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Is this the one where her arm gets
Yeah. And
dislocated?
you can see, look at the tension there. You know,
Yeah, it was
that's
lucky
real.
that knife didn't cut her.
Yeah. Yeah, that's real. A lot of it was done. You know, we had so many parts to cast that I don't have really specific memories. In some cases, I do, but not in all. And
did any of the women feel reluctant to be in violent situations like that, or is it just the case with all actors, they want to work?
Yeah,
Nudity's not, and frequently, you know, with casting, they'll say, "Can you ride a bike? Can you do this?"
Yeah.
Yes, and then you get them in on set, and they can't do any of it, but they're not going to say no, are they?
We often had that with nudity. They would not expose a breast when you got right down to the shooting, the filming.
Well, it speaks well of Gene Davis that, you know, he was. I just would be curious to know what he thought of this in terms of how it affected his career, and because he gives such a strong performance in this, and yet we didn't hear much from him afterwards.
But, you know, I think in terms of the nudity, as I remember, and this is really, my memory could be faulty on this, we never, you know, a lot of how things were going to be done happened on the set. So you know, nowadays, if you look at the casting breakdowns that come out every day, anytime there's any kind of nudity, the breakdown says so right up front. And we weren't putting that in the breakdowns then.
No. Well, so our audience will understand, at the time that we were doing this kind of thing, there was a breakdown service. And when I was an agent, I would get this breakdown at 6 a.m. delivered to my doorstep.
Exactly.
I would then open it up, and what it would have is the casting descriptions for all the studios for television and features. It told you the age range, what type, what kind of characters they were looking for, and you had to get your submissions in. I would get the sheets. Now it's all online, of course.
Everything's online, and it's all day long. You would get the submissions in whenever you had your go-between. The messenger service would come by at a certain time,
and the breakdown service was put together by actors. They had been actors,
right?
Because I met them.
Put down first, and that would come. You're right. It would be delivered first thing in the morning.
Right.
The mimeographed version. Stacks of it, and then the breakdowns go out, and the agents all put together their packets of pictures and resumes, and would send them out with the go-between, the messenger service that would come every day at the same time, 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, whenever it was. You had to get it all done by then. Now it's all day long, and all the submissions are online.
And also they have like acting scenes that are on. It's all,
and the demos are all online too. So you get the breakdown.
You don't really have to see a human being until you're ready.
Yeah, and now the casting process is completely different because a lot of the casting is done with Skype or with sending in. You know, you put yourself on tape.
Well, next week I'm doing an audio commentary with an actress in Toronto, and we're watching the movie via Skype. She has her print there in Toronto. I have my print here, and we just synchronize it so that when you're listening to it, we might as well be in the same room, but you don't have to be.
Yeah, but a lot of it, like I say, a lot of it is the actors putting themselves on tape.
Well, you said earlier that when you put out the casting notice for this, you weren't really concerned if the actor was in shape. But aren't you glad he is? Because, I mean, can you imagine seeing some...
That was this particular role. The description of it was completely wide open because what was necessary was the insanity, was the craziness. So he could have been fat, skinny, 18, 27. It didn't matter. So it was just this whole range.
Well, you know, the interesting thing in, say, something like, well, you know, the movie that changed it all was Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. The novel for Psycho was written by Robert Bloch, and in the original story, as Bloch wrote it, Norman Bates was a balding, short, kind of greasy little man that had a little motel, and when he kills the girl in the shower, he cuts off her head. Well, of course, in 1960, you showed this to Alfred Hitchcock. Well, that's not going. And look what he did. He created the character of Norman Bates as played by Anthony Perkins. And that completely not only changed Perkins' career, who had been a romantic lead up till then.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if, well, see, all of this with the nurses and the girl hiding under the bed, they're just taking bits from the Richard Speck, the real life case of Richard Speck.
Like I say, with the breakdowns, because we were using breakdowns then, but the description of the character that went out for Gene did not say nudity required. But now SAG makes you say nudity required in the breakdown. That's...
Well, you have to, I mean, you're wasting your time if you get somebody and they read well and then they won't perform.
Right.
What are you going to do? You have to start over. But you were very lucky to have gotten him, because I think one of the reasons this movie is where it is today is this unhinged perforence by Gene Davis.
He's perfect for it. There's no question.
I mean, he literally, I guess Jay Lee must have been. He never dialed it down.
No.
Were you on set for a lot of this? As far as
not a lot. I would come on set because, as I said, a lot of the times we continued casting right through the movie because there were so many parts, and the smaller parts that could wait that were further on, I would be coming to the set and either bringing actors there to read or we're meeting people. It were small parts. It would go fairly quickly, but that was really how I was on set, not so much to really stand around watching the shooting. Every now and then I would just...
Were a number of these, do you imagine they had a closed set for a lot of this? Or what? Do you remember, Mr. Kohner,
We were such a small crew anyway, and we weren't anywhere public.
Except when you were on the street, as far as...
And that was at night in the VA.
So it was
it was not a problem.
Were you on set a lot for this?
Always, yes.
So what do you any special memories while we're watching the final act of this terrifying?
And let me just jump, because I know from working with Pancho, very hands-on.
Well,
after 8 movies, yes.
Very hands-on, absolutely. From day one.
I had worked on a lot of films, but my first being a producer was also as a director-producer. So I had directed 2 early films and then started producing these films with Jay Lee. And so I was fascinated with directing and watching him and see how he handled the situation, how he told the story with the camera. So I must say, I sat right with him. And we shared the trailers, shared our meals. It was... just a privilege to be with a good director.
Yes.
And the other thing that I say is Pancho is also as low-key as you're seeing Pancho now. That's how low-key Pancho is as a producer.
I see.
It's... I have never seen, and I've been on a lot of sets with Pancho, I've never seen him really yelling or screaming or having...
Did Jay Lee have a temper when he was working, or did he always seem to be rather easygoing?
On one of the first films, he argued with me, and he said, I'm going to go straight to Dino De Laurentiis. And I smiled. I said, Jay Lee, Dino's busy with King Kong. You're going to have to resolve this with me. And we that was the only other time that and we always resolved any differences. Yeah. If he wanted something that we couldn't afford, I'd say, okay, but then you're going to have to give up something here, and that's for real, because these are pictures made on a certain budget.
I remember going to a screening of King Kong when De Laurentiis' son, I think it was, who died tragically. Yeah. He was really hands-on with that. And people were walking out of the screening, and it didn't go well because King Kong did not do what they thought it would do. And I've forgotten his name. Was it Federico? Federico De Laurentiis. He stood there at the door and shook everyone's hand. And later on, John Peters, who was filming A Star is Born with Streisand, who was also his girlfriend, he walked up to De Laurentiis and he said, well, I've got a big budget film coming up, Dino. I mean, it's going to make King Kong. It's going to be bigger than King Kong. And Dino looked at him and said, well, the difference between our pictures is your monkey sings and mine doesn't.
I'm glad you said that and I didn't.
That's one of my favorite De Laurentiis stories,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, Dino was a character.
He was a great
Dino
character.
as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he owned that restaurant in Beverly Hills. Remember, it was a giant kind of pasta.
Yeah, and then in New York as well.
It was the two of them. But the one
Right.
in New York, I remember we had the wrap party for the Year of the Dragon there. And it was great. Now here's the famous. This is the scene that no one will forget. This is, he's telling him, I'll just come back.
Right.
And look at how Bronson. Look at that face.
One day they'll get out. That's the law. That's the law. That's the law.
So it's really just Kessler's daughter is there.
Yes.
Civilian. The rest are all men in blue.
And they keep up. There it is.
And it really is the perfect ending for this film.
Well, it's the only.
It winds up being
it's
the only
ending.
But not just only, but perfect. It really, that is the character.
And Jay Lee's up here. It's a great. His sense of framing is always rather spot on. Look at this cast. It's really.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say, gentlemen, it has been my pleasure to sit here and be the beneficiary of your knowledge and your experience, Mr. Kohner, John. This has been a really, really interesting experience. This is David Del Val at filmsandreview.com talking with the esteemed Pancho Kohner. And John, this has been fun for me with you watching this movie. 10 to Midnight, a cult film extraordinaire.